Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be looking at what is the difference between early, middle, and late Plato. Now, Plato wrote at least 26 dialogues in his life, which serve as the foundational canon of Western philosophy. However, scholars do not know the order in which these dialogues were written, or which, if any, of the other 19 dialogues which have been sometimes attributed to Plato were written by him. We're only going to really look at the 26 for now, despite the fact that some of the 19 are very commonly attributed to Plato by most philosophers. This video is not going to focus directly on the content of these dialogues, but rather on a theory that categorizes them into three distinct periods of Plato's thought to explain what seemed to be differences in Plato's philosophical views as well as changes in his style. So, this theory identifies Plato as having three distinct periods, each of which are identified with a subset of his dialogues. These divisions are claimed to track both philosophical developments in Plato's thinking, as well as stylistic changes in his presentation of these dialogues. While the theory provides an interesting story of what might have given us the dialogues that we have, it's far from certain, and there are many other explanations for the changes we see in Plato's writing. In this video, we'll first cover the three periods in Plato's writing, and then we'll look at some reasons that you might question this theory of explanation for Plato's works. So, starting with the early dialogues. This is a group of dialogues which feature Socrates prominently and have Socrates question various figures of Athens about knowledge and virtue without offering a clearly positive view himself. These dialogues are generally short and simple. They focus less on metaphysics or politics and more on what makes a good life or how we can know what virtue is. These early dialogues are often considered more Plato documenting Socrates' views and are supposed to have been written not long after the death of Socrates, early in Plato's philosophical life. Now, it's notable that various schools that claimed heritage from the doctrines of Socrates seem to focus on elements that are found in these texts, but not necessarily the elements that are found in Plato's other works, such as in the middle and late periods. We have the skeptics focusing on the questioning of knowledge of others. We have the Stoics focusing on virtue being the only good, and the Cynics taking inspiration from both lines of thought, questioning both societal conventions in general, as well as the specific idea of material goods being a good thing when compared to virtue. And so we can see clear lineages from these early ideas of Socrates into these other schools, whereas things like Plato's theories of the forms don't translate as directly into schools that claim lineage from Socrates. So this might be a point in favor of this view as separating these early dialogues out as more the views of Socrates and less of Plato. Specifically, the group generally includes Apology, Charmides, Crito, Euthydemus, Euthyphro, Gorgias, Hippias Minor, Ion, Laches, Lysis, and Protagoras. Some argue that Gorgias and Protagoras do not belong in this category as they're more complex and cover more intricate philosophical themes. Parmenides has the impact of a negative dialogue, offering various puzzling, contradictory conclusions, but not resolving them. However, it doesn't really fit with the early dialogues because of the other characteristics, such as it examines and critiques the theory of forms, it's generally more complex than the early dialogues, etc. So despite having a little bit of that negative view, Parmenides is usually considered a later dialogue. Sometimes the first book of the Republic is identified with this period, since it appears to offer how the real Socrates would investigate the question of justice, though the rest of the Republic offers more of Plato's positive viewpoint. So broadly, the early dialogues are characterized by a negative viewpoint, Socrates questioning the views of others, as opposed to offering a strong positive viewpoint himself. They're more focused on the good life, ethics, and knowledge and virtue. In Plato's middle period, he spends less time documenting the views of Socrates, supposedly, or so the theory goes, and more time expressing his own positive philosophical viewpoint. In these dialogues, Plato expresses views about more than just ethics and epistemology, expanding to the methods that should be used by philosophy, as well as more opinions on metaphysics, such as his theory of the forms and the immortality of the soul. This is a clear evolution from Socrates in the Apology, who doubts that we can know what happened after death, a clear contrast to the idea of the immortality of the soul. Plato begins to offer clear, if tentative, positive definitions of things like virtue or justice, which were just questioned or we only had negative viewpoints on in the early dialogues, but for which no positive view was offered. These dialogues are also generally longer and more complex than the supposedly early dialogues. In some sources, the middle period is divided into an early middle period consisting of Cratylus, Menexenus, and Meno, a main middle period consisting of Phaedo, the Republic, and Symposium, and a late period including Parmenides, Theaetetus, and Phaedrus. Others simply lump all of these dialogues together into a general middle period. Finally, the late dialogues are 6 works which share a common style, which is more evident in the original Greek than in more recent translations, as well as a more developed view of the forms, possibly in response to the critiques outlined in Parmenides. These dialogues are considered late, both because they seem to reference earlier dialogues throughout them and bring back up problems dealt with in earlier dialogues, but also because they are all written in a similar style to Laws, which is widely viewed as one of Plato's last dialogues, if not his very last dialogue. The late dialogues are generally identified as Sophist, Statesman, Philebus, Timaeus, Critias, and Laws. While there is some agreement in philosophers that these dialogues are stylistically different from the other middle dialogues, there is debate amongst philosophers as to whether these represent a philosophically distinct position from the middle dialogues. As there's less of that clear distinction, these are dealing with issues more in depth, but perhaps they're better seen as kind of a next level response to criticisms of the more positive views put forward in the middle dialogues than a completely separate or distinct position. But that's open for debate. Now, while this is a nice story that fits many of the details that we have about Plato's dialogues and can be helpful for new philosophers who are trying to grasp and categorize the many dialogues of Plato into kind of sensible chunks, there are some reasons to think that it may not provide the whole picture. While it's unlikely that Plato started with a work like the Republic or Laws, it is quite possible that he continued writing shorter dialogues that documented the life of Socrates later into his life. He might have, for example, alternated between more accessible shorter dialogues for a broad audience and more complex ones for a more sophisticated audience. There's no reason that he necessarily had to get all of those dialogues about Socrates that were short and had the more negative views out of the way initially. Additionally, some philosophers have made the case that Plato's voice is actually stronger than initially perceived in the early dialogues, arguing it's unlikely that such a clever philosopher would be solely recording a conversation and not using it as a tool for thinking through or advancing his own position. We may never be able to truly distinguish between the real Socrates and the Socrates that Plato just uses to explain many of his views. This early, middle, and late framing gives us a certain sense that these early dialogues are the views of Socrates, whereas the middle and late dialogues are the views of Plato, which to a certain degree is corroborated by some contemporaneous sources such as Aristotle. But to another degree, Plato may be doing some work even in those early dialogues to push his own views that may not be as obvious as the late or the middle dialogues, but may still be there. Stay tuned for a video from XFi on how we can use artificial intelligence to categorize Plato's dialogues and to test out this theory that there is a clear division between early, middle, and late Plato. It's going to be a cool video. If you're watching this video later, we may already have a card up to show a link to it, but definitely check it out when it comes out. Subscribe to this channel, subscribe to XFi so you can stay up on all the videos that we're putting out. Hit the notification bell, watch this video and more here at Carneades.org, and stay skeptical.